I've had a few more days to sit with this album, kind of avoid any other people trying to throw their takes down my throat. For the longest time, the thing that's driven me to Earl Sweatshirt's music was just the rawness. It's as if he felt the biggest favor he could do to someone listening to his music was to tell them the most harsh truth. Whether that truth be toward himself, the music industry that he's rapping in, to his listener. Earl made it apparent that he wanted to be known as an artist living in his reality more than anyone else. That reality doesn't necessarily have to be positive, it just has to be honest. So now we're at a point in Earl's career where he decided to reinvent himself again and drop some rap songs, literally. And I mentioned honesty before because when I go into this album and I keep listening to it, Earl obviously has references and tracks here that are simply for his own catharsis, tracks that aren't necessarily meant to be related to or internalized by the people listening to the music. And I like that he doesn't make these lyrical or musical compromises to make his music more catchy or have a more relatable message for his audience. I mean, when I think about it, sure, depression is a thing that's affecting a lot of our youth, especially today, and possibly even back then when it wasn't so as easily identifiable. But this depression shows up on some rap songs as a deeply rooted, long-term, unnoticed issue specific to Sweatshirt himself. One thing that's gonna throw me off, and it'll throw other listeners off, I'm sure, is the improper mixing on this album. I do appreciate the lack of proper mixing on this album from the standpoint of Earl trying to be swallowed up or lost in the environment or the aesthetic of the album. It's an atmosphere that a large portion of these tracks do manage to provide. It's an intention that's made much more apparent by the cheerful and triumphant production that we get on the final track, where it seems Earl has finally reached this peak or this moment in the album where he finds some solace or some serenity. I appreciate the serenity that he alludes to finding on the final track doesn't accompany the aesthetic of the entire album, as the album itself seems to lead us atmospherically from the tempests on tracks like Peanut, where Earl raps about losing people very close to him, to the jubilance of a track like Riot, a track, ironically, that is very different in aesthetic than you would get from an actual Riot. Again, I think it could be appreciated for what this album is talking about. However, it is not an objective truth that this album becomes greater because of its poor mixing. It's not some objective truth that the poor mixing on this album makes it sound better to every listener. We simply have a reason for why that mixing exists in the first place, which, if thought about appropriately, can make you appreciate the overall theme of the album that much more, but it doesn't have to change your musical appetite. If you don't like the mix, you don't like the mix. No amount of reasoning is gonna make you like it more. The first two tracks definitely lay the groundwork and expose us to the album's foundation as Earl raps about his comprehension of his now acknowledged depression and negligence and lack of acknowledgement of those around him acknowledging his depression at the same time. However, a point that I like about this album and a point that I like about the first two initial tracks is Earl makes it a point not to place the blame or the responsibility of his mental health on those around him, and instead recognizes the neglect of their own mental health by way of lines like "Peace to my dirty water drinkers, ain't nobody really trying to get clean." Here I just appreciate how the line can not only be used as a reference to Earl using alcohol as a crutch for his own issues, but the people around him that he questioned earlier, conceding to the idea that people don't just have time to watch him all day and night. They've got their own shit to deal with too. He also mentions his ability to see through the rap game, noticing when people aren't being authentic. One of the lines here that I think is unintentionally great is when he says, "Niggas don't listen till they whole mission a bust," which, even though I'm sure recorded long before it, so accurately describes 6ix9ine's legal battle right now. Going through tracks like Cold Summer, we have an Earl Sweatshirt who's actively acknowledging his lack of fulfillment in life and his inability to move forward due to substance abuse and other lifestyle choices, how he doesn't see a brighter future for himself but is determined to see it through to the end regardless, even if that means he has to hide his pain and hide his sorrow to prevent himself from thinking about it. But see, the thing that I like about the album is now that Earl's acknowledged that he has a problem, it's that much harder for him to ignore it, and has now made conscious efforts in order to silence himself from thinking about it. Lines that talks about muzzling his brain. He sees an issue, he sees a problem, and now he's running from it. But then we get the next track, Nowhere to Go. I just love how on this track, Cold Summer, it's basically a reference to Earl acknowledging his issue but trying to escape from it as opposed to confronting it. And then the very next track is called Nowhere to Go, meaning there's nowhere left for me to run, there's nowhere left for me to hide, I have to sit here and confront the issue. Earl talks on this track from past tense and from the present about how he's dealing with his feelings, adding that people aren't going to change how he feels, regardless of what coast people allow him to claim or how many fans back him. He has to deal with this, and it's right here in front of him. It's acknowledging his past, but it also acknowledges how easy it is to fall back to it by saying he uses the people around him as examples of what not to do. Even December 24, Earl is referencing his state of mind being limited to what he can see and not for what he believes in. He's referencing his environment, and that's it. Simply existing and dying. And there are many references as far as the songs are concerned on this album that Earl calls back to. I think on the track On the Way, Earl raps about his mother's warnings not to pick at his scabs, but wanting to revisit the past. Something he does multiple times on this album, but finds himself asking himself why he's bleeding earlier in this album. Meaning that it's not only painful for Earl to go back and revisit these old wounds and these old emotions, but why it was such an easy solution for him to go with unnoticed depression for so long. But it's also the reason he prevents himself from doing so and decides to confront these feelings and negative emotions on tracks like Nowhere to Go. Why he's referencing why he can no longer run from the issue. On the Way, sonically speaking, again, has a great soul sample. I love how it sounds. Again, for a song like this, if we're speaking sonically, I just wish the mixing was better. Again, I can appreciate how it references the theme of the album and Earl trying to be swallowed up, but I think if it were cleaned up, or if Earl matched the vintage atmosphere that the soul sample and the original song actually have, he would sound like he was one with the song. He would sound completely in it. On this track, I don't really think he sounds swallowed up. I just think on this track, he sounds like he was put in a tornado or put in a musical typhoon rather than being there before the track started, if that makes sense. I feel like Earl is a little out of place on a track like this, only because of how vintage the music sounds versus him. Mint is still my favorite track on this album. I love the lyrical references. I love that Earl is rapping from a more consistent point of view right now. He's not perfect, but he's saying he has a little bit more control over the symptoms. In The Bends is another track where Earl raps about adapting to his circumstances and not bitching about the cards that he was dealt. This album is very constant, and it shows Earl's ability to adapt more than it shows his ability to understand. He seems less concerned with the why am I depressed and more concerned with the now that I'm depressed, what do I do next? And I think that's the thing about this album that I really love, because it's an Earl Sweatshirt that isn't trying to be rid of his depression. It's an Earl Sweatshirt that isn't trying to get rid of or escape these emotions. It's an Earl that's sitting with them as opposed to running from them. He's living in real time, acknowledging that this is still an issue, but I'm gonna live with it. I'm not gonna give up. I'm gonna stay consistent. I'm gonna adapt, which is why the final track, Riot, to me makes so much more sense, because it's finally a track where Earl has found a somewhat positive medium out of all the chaos that we had to go through to get to that end result. This album sonically offers me a level of discombobulation that Earl manages to reassemble well enough lyrically for me to believe that he's able to amend himself in any environment. And lyrically, this album is some of Earl's best work. Like, if you didn't like the album sonically, lyrically, I think he just completely saves it. The constant loops in the music on this album easily remind me of artists like MF Doom, Rock Marciano, Ka. That use of looping and that use of soul samples that you would get on projects like Behold a Dark Horse from Rock Marciano, or Orpheus versus the Sirens from Hermit and the Recluse, or Czar meets Metalface, their album that came out earlier this year. I think the major difference is just how broken and fragmented and discombobulated an album like this sounds in comparison. Even though it's got loops and it's got its musical references, it still manages to capture a dark, depressed, very broken aesthetic. And we all define beauty in different ways, so this album personally is far from beautiful. In my opinion, it's more of an attainable medium that Earl manages to secure, which should, if any person with depression were to listen to this album, make them feel a little bit more hopeful as opposed to jaded. I think the end result is what's beautiful in my opinion, not necessarily the process in getting there. which again, in my opinion, is okay. It's okay not to view your whole life as this beautiful masterpiece that ended up leading you to this moment where you're like, I appreciate those things that happened to me because it shaped the way I think right now. No, I think acknowledging that you had a shitty life or you were doing shitty things or your mental state back then was shitty is okay. I think the album sounds shitty and it's okay. I like that it sounds shitty on some parts because it gives me moments to look back on as I got to this point, because the end of the album sounds great. So those are my final thoughts on Earl's Some Rap Songs. I do think it's my favorite Earl project. It's written better. It's tackled in a much more mature way. It's acknowledgement of one's own fear to recognize and acknowledge one's own fear. And I think he does so in just such an authentic, homegrown way. And I like it more than I did when I first heard it. So Earl Sweatshirt, Some Rap Songs. Thank y'all for watching. I'll see you in the next one. And I'm out. Let me know how you feel about it. I gotta go. Oh, Jesus. I was trying to hold it in. Let me know how you feel about it. And I'll see you next time. I'm out. Peace.